Before we dive into the full story, take a moment to imagine this: you're watching one of those disturbing true crime documentaries that feels too chilling to be real. Only this one is real. And it happened in a quiet neighborhood on South Korea's Jeju Island. This isn't just another true crime documentary full episode or a historical true crime case. It's one of the most brutal true crime documentaries you've likely never heard of, until now. On the evening of July 18, 2021, police received a frantic call from a mother. She had just returned home to find her teenage son murdered. His body was bound, bruised, and lifeless. This was no accident. It was a crime that had been building for weeks, maybe months. It would soon become one of the most shocking real crime documentary stories in recent years, a story of obsession, domestic violence, and justice delayed. If you're drawn to true crime documentaries with real footage, serial killer documentary content, or the kind of crime thriller documentaries that leave you shaken, then what follows will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. This is not fiction. This is a real stories murder documentary that reveals what happens when the system fails to protect the innocent. So get ready, because this is not just a crazy true crime documentary. It's a real tragedy. And it's time we told it in full. Chapter 1, The Calm Before the Storm. Jin Kyung-hyun was a boy of 16 with an earnest smile and bright eyes full of hope. Living in a modest home in Jeju, South Korea, he was a middle school student with dreams much like any other teenager: to finish his studies, to make his mother proud, and to carve out a future that promised happiness and peace. Jin was a quiet boy, often shy but deeply caring, especially towards his mother, Pyo. He had grown up in a household shadowed by complexity but never lost his gentle spirit. Pyo, Jin's mother, was a woman shaped by strength and endurance. She had faced many challenges, yet her love for Jin was unwavering. She had hoped for a stable life, for herself and her son, but fate had other plans. Years earlier, Pyo had met Baek Gwang-suk, a man who would soon come to darken their lives. At first, Baek seemed like any other man, charming and attentive, but over time, his true nature emerged. Their relationship was marked by tension and control. Baek's charm masked a volatile temper and possessive tendencies. He demanded to know where Pyo was at all times, and any perceived slight or delay sparked his fury. Slowly, the man who once held promises in his words became a source of fear. Jin, perceptive beyond his years, observed the changes with growing worry. He noticed the shattered phones his mother carried, a symbol of Baek's controlling wrath when he destroyed them out of jealousy or anger. He heard the arguments, sometimes muffled but always harsh. At school, Jin would retreat into himself, carrying the weight of his family's troubles silently. Despite the darkness at home, Jin held on to hope. He believed in his mother's strength and dreamed of a day when they would be free from Baek's shadow. He often sat beside Pyo during quiet evenings, sharing small moments of laughter and comfort, the fragile moments that reminded them both of a life worth fighting for. But beneath the surface, tension simmered like a storm waiting to break. Baek's jealousy and violence escalated over time, his demands growing more unreasonable, his punishments harsher. When Pyo tried to leave, Baek's threats deepened. He warned her that leaving would mean losing everything, and that he would never let her go peacefully. Jin, protective and courageous, often stepped in to defend his mother. On several occasions, he confronted Baek, pleading for peace, begging him to stop. But Baek's fury only intensified, and Jin became a target himself, accused of ruining Baek's life. The boy's quiet demeanor masked a brewing courage that would, tragically, not be enough to save him. The household, once a place of safety and warmth, became a battleground. Pyo tried to shield Jin from Baek's outbursts, but the scars of violence were impossible to hide. Jin bore bruises and wounds in secret, his pain unspoken but ever present. Neighbors sometimes heard shouting or saw signs of struggle, but domestic issues were often kept private. Stigma and fear prevented intervention. Pyo was reluctant to seek help, fearing retaliation, or disbelief. The community, unaware of the true danger, offered little more than sympathy. As days passed, the sense of foreboding grew. Jin's school attendance became erratic, his grades slipping. Teachers noticed his withdrawn behavior but attributed it to adolescence. No one could guess the full extent of the torment he endured. The story of Jin Kyunghyun is not just a tale of one boy's tragic fate but a reflection of many families trapped in cycles of abuse. It is a story about courage in the face of fear, about the desperate hope for freedom, and the tragic cost when protection fails. As the storm gathered, Jin and Pyo clung to what little light remained. They held on to memories of better days, the laughter before the tears, the moments of calm before the chaos. But beneath it all, the shadows lengthened, and the calm before the storm was nearing its end. Chapter 2: The Cycle of Violence. As time passed, the violence in Jin Kyunghyun's home became a relentless storm that never ceased. What had once been isolated outbursts from Baek Gwang-suk grew into a regular cycle of abuse, each episode more devastating than the last. For Jin and his mother Pyo, life was no longer just about survival, it was a daily battle against fear itself. Baek's anger was unpredictable and fierce. It could be triggered by the smallest inconvenience, a late text message, a forgotten chore, or even Pyo's attempts to maintain some independence. His control extended to every corner of their lives. Phones were shattered not just once or twice, but repeatedly. The broken devices lay like silent witnesses to his rage. Jin, still only a boy, bore the brunt of Baek's wrath on multiple occasions. There were days when Baek's fury was directed squarely at him, accusing him of interfering or spoiling Pyo's relationship with him. Jin would be shouted at, pushed, or struck, but he rarely cried out. Instead, he clenched his fists and tried to shield his mother, absorbing the pain as if to protect her from even greater harm. Pyo's heart broke each time she saw her son suffer. Her love for Jin was fierce, but so was her fear. The scars on Jin's body were physical, but the wounds deeper, etched into his spirit. She felt trapped in a nightmare that showed no signs of ending. Reaching out for help seemed impossible, the fear of Baek's retaliation and the stigma of being judged kept her silent. Despite several interventions by the police, the system seemed ill-equipped to stop the cycle. Baek's anger was well known to the authorities, but without concrete evidence, or with Pyo unwilling or unable to testify, their hands were tied. Each time police arrived, the threats from Baek intensified once they left, punishing Pyo and Jin further. Neighbors heard shouting at night, harsh words, cries, and objects smashing. Yet most stayed silent. Domestic violence remained a private matter, shrouded in shame and fear of becoming involved. Pyo felt isolated, with few friends or family willing or able to intervene. Jin's school life reflected the chaos at home. He would arrive tired and withdrawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Teachers noted the bruises he tried to hide, and the way he flinched when spoken to sharply. But without a clear understanding or evidence, the school's efforts to reach out were limited. One particularly violent incident left Jin hospitalized for a week. Baek's rage had exploded after a minor argument. Pyo tried to intervene, but Baek turned on her as well, pushing her to the floor. Jin had stepped between them and was struck repeatedly. The hospital staff reported the injuries to social services, but the process of protection was slow and bureaucratic. Emotionally, Jin began to shut down. The boy who once dreamed of a peaceful future found himself drowning in despair. Fear was now his constant companion. He stopped speaking about his home life, fearing what might happen if he told the truth. Pyo, meanwhile, struggled with guilt and helplessness. She had tried to leave Baek multiple times but was met with threats and violence each time. Baek would promise to change but never did. Each promise was a lie, a momentary calm before the next storm. The psychological toll was immense. Jin and Pyo lived in a prison of terror, with Baek as their cruel jailer. Pyo's health deteriorated as anxiety and depression took hold. Jin's school attendance became more erratic, and he withdrew from friends and activities he once loved. Outside the walls of their home, the world moved on, oblivious to the torment within. Social services tried to intervene but were hampered by lack of cooperation and resources. Each failed attempt to break the cycle felt like another brick added to the walls surrounding Jin and Pyo. In the darkest moments, Jin's resilience shone through. He found small ways to cope, listening to music late at night, drawing quietly, and seeking refuge in the school library. These moments of escape, though fleeting, kept a flicker of hope alive. But Beck's violence was relentless, and the warning signs went unheeded. The damage to Jin's body and soul deepened with each passing day. The fragile hope that one day they might be free from fear seemed to slip further away. This cycle of violence, abuse, and helplessness was not just a story of one family, but a harsh reality faced by many. It illustrated how deep the scars of domestic violence run and how the systems meant to protect often fall short. For Jin and Pyo, life was a constant question: how long could they endure? How many more bruises, more broken promises, more nights filled with terror would it take before something changed? The storm was gathering, and the calm they once hoped for was fading into the past. What lay ahead was unknown, but the shadows looming over them were growing darker and more threatening. Chapter 3: The Breaking Point. The unbearable cycle of violence and fear that Jin and his mother Pyo endured stretched on for years, leaving deep marks on their lives. But as with many stories of abuse, there came a moment when the unbearable became impossible to ignore, a breaking point that would change everything. One cold evening, Beck's anger erupted with unprecedented fury. It began like many other nights, with a seemingly minor disagreement, this time over money. Beck accused Pyo of hiding financial information, his voice rising into a harsh scream. Jin sat quietly in the corner, heart pounding, knowing that the fragile peace would shatter once more. Pyo tried to calm Beck, her voice trembling but firm. She begged him to stop, promising to explain everything. But Beck's rage was a force beyond reason. Without warning, he lashed out, shoving Pyo against the wall. The sound of the impact echoed through the small apartment, sending a chill down Jin's spine. Jin sprang into action, pushing Beck away, desperate to protect his mother. But Beck was bigger and stronger. The struggle quickly turned violent, and before Jin could react, Beck's fist connected with his face. Pain exploded in Jin's cheek, but he refused to back down. Fear and anger fueled him. In the chaos, Pyo managed to call for help on her phone, but Beck snatched it away, breaking the device with a brutal stomp. The room was filled with shouting, crashing furniture, and desperate cries. Neighbors heard the commotion but hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. In a moment of terrifying clarity, Jin realized that the violence had spiraled beyond control. This was no longer just about anger or frustration, it was a dangerous and escalating threat to their lives. The house was no longer a home, it was a battlefield. After Beck stormed out into the cold night, Pyo collapsed into tears, holding Jin tightly. They both knew this could not continue. Jin's face was swollen, his eyes red with pain and exhaustion. Pyo's heart ached, torn between fear for her son and helplessness against the man she once loved. That night marked a turning point. Pyo resolved she had to find a way out, no matter the cost. She began reaching out to friends she had distanced herself from, and to social services, though fear still held her back. The scars were not only on their bodies but deep in their souls, carved by years of torment and broken trust. But escaping Beck's grasp was never easy. He was manipulative, capable of sweet words and promises that belied his violent nature. Each time Pyo tried to leave, Beck found ways to pull her back with threats, intimidation, or moments of false tenderness. Jin, meanwhile, was caught in the middle. He loved his mother fiercely and hated seeing her hurt, but he also struggled to understand the complex emotions twisting through their lives. Sometimes he felt anger at Beck, other times, guilt for not being able to protect them better. At school, Jin's teachers grew increasingly concerned. His grades dropped, and he became withdrawn. He no longer spoke about his home life, afraid that revealing the truth might bring more pain or lead to more violence. The school counselor tried to offer support, but Jin remained silent, trapped in a world he couldn't escape. One afternoon, the inevitable happened. Beck returned to their home unannounced and enraged. The argument that followed was worse than before. Pyo pleaded for peace, but Beck's fury was uncontrollable. Jean tried to intervene again, standing between them. This time, Beck's violence took a devastating turn. In a blind rage, he attacked Jean with a weapon, an act that would forever alter the course of their lives. The violence was swift and brutal, leaving Jean gravely injured. The aftermath was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and hospital rooms. Pyo sat beside Jin's bed, holding his hand tightly as doctors worked to save him. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. The dream of escape, of freedom from fear, now felt more urgent than ever. Social workers and police became involved in ways they never had before. The evidence was undeniable. Beck was arrested, charged with assault and domestic violence. For the first time, there was hope that the nightmare might end. But even as Beck faced justice, the damage he inflicted lingered. Jin's injuries were both physical and emotional. The trauma had carved deep scars, and healing would be a long, painful journey. Pyo resolved to protect Jean at all costs. She began working with counselors and support groups, slowly rebuilding her strength and helping her son find his voice. The road ahead was uncertain, but the breaking point had passed. What had once been a life dominated by fear was now slowly becoming a story of survival and resilience. Though the darkness remained, the first rays of light had begun to shine through. Chapter 4, The Final Act. As July of 2021 unfolded, the tension between Beck Gwang-suk and Pyo, along with her son Jean Jae-hyun, reached a breaking point that no one could ignore. The years of abuse, control, and fear had created a powder keg ready to explode. Despite efforts to protect themselves, the shadows of violence loomed large, threatening to engulf the family entirely. Pyo had tried everything within her power to escape Beck's grip. She sought help from the police multiple times, reported the abuse, and asked for protection. Yet, the response from the authorities was frustratingly slow and inadequate. The police, bound by their protocols, often treated these incidents as mere domestic disputes, offering little more than temporary mediation. They failed to see the dangerous pattern underlying Beck's behavior, a pattern that foreshadowed tragedy. Even after installing surveillance cameras around the house, the protection was superficial at best. The cameras were offline storage devices, incapable of sending real-time alerts. Beck, cunning and persistent, easily circumnavigated these measures. In fact, he had his own surveillance system installed in a restaurant he frequented, allowing him to monitor Pyo's movements and maintain his oppressive control from a distance. One night in early July, things escalated again. Pyo awoke to a sudden, brutal attack. Masked assailants broke into her home, striking her with fists and feet, nearly strangling her in a terrifying assault. Jean, alerted by the noise, rushed downstairs just in time to scare the attackers away. But the damage was done, both physical and psychological wounds deepened. Police were called, but with the assailants masked, their identities remained unknown. The case was recorded as a family dispute, without further investigation. This left Pyo and Jean vulnerable, trapped in a cycle where violence was met with bureaucratic apathy. Beck's threats grew more chilling. Over the phone, he coldly warned Pyo, "If you dare call the police again, I will hurt the one you love most, your son." These words were not empty, they carried the weight of a man who had already demonstrated a capacity for extreme cruelty. Jean, despite being only 16, tried to take matters into his own hands. He started training physically, determined to protect his mother no matter what. Yet Pyo constantly urged caution. "Don't fight fire with fire," she warned, "keep the doors and windows locked. Let the police handle this." It was a desperate hope that the system would eventually protect them. On July 16, the police finally installed surveillance cameras outside their home, 2 devices that might have provided real-time monitoring. However, their implementation was flawed, and the coverage was incomplete. Still, it was a sign of progress, albeit a delayed one. But Beck was no stranger to surveillance, and on the very night the cameras were installed, he appeared near the property. He lingered for hours, his presence a silent but menacing threat. Though no direct action was taken that night, his intentions were clear, the game was far from over. July 17 came and went with Beck appearing again, but still restrained under the watchful eyes of the cameras. The family's brief hope for safety was tinged with anxiety. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before Beck made his move. And on July 18, the tragic climax unfolded. Early that morning, Beck and his accomplice Kim Si-nam prepared for their sinister plan. They purchased gloves and green tape, tools that would soon be used to silence a young life. At 3:16 p.m., both men, wearing white gloves, climbed over the roof to break into Pyo and Jin's home. Inside, the scene quickly descended into horror. Jin was bound tightly with green tape around his hands, feet, and mouth. His face and body bore the marks of brutal violence, bruises telling a story of suffering and desperation. 2 smashed phones lay on the ground beside him, and the floor was slick with spilled cooking oil, a strange but deliberate act, perhaps meant to set fire or destroy evidence. 25 minutes after entering, Kim left alone, disposing of the gloves and receiving 7 million Korean won from Beck as payment for the crime. Beck lingered for hours longer before finally leaving under cover of darkness. Pyo was nowhere to be found at the time, she was away, but Beck's plan was clear. Experts later speculated that Beck intended to return and kill Pyo, then set the house ablaze to erase all traces. This was not just an act of violence, it was cold, calculated destruction. When police arrived that night, the horror was undeniable. Jin was dead, his life cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. The community was shaken. How could such a tragedy happen despite multiple warnings and cries for help? Beck's arrest came swiftly. When confronted, he gave chilling reasons. Jin had never called him father, which infuriated Beck. He claimed his motive was not murder but punishment, a twisted logic that horrified everyone. Beck denied delivering the fatal blow, instead blaming Kim Si-nam. Kim, for his part, also denied responsibility for the killing but admitted to violence. The two men played a dangerous game of blame, but the damage was irreversible. The court later revealed DNA evidence found on the murder weapon, a belt. Beck's DNA was in the middle section, and Kim's was found on both ends, proving their joint involvement. On December 9, 2021, the Jeju District Court sentenced Beck to 30 years in prison and Kim to 27 years, holding both responsible for Jin's murder. But for Pyo and the community, no sentence could bring back a young boy whose life ended amid neglect, abuse, and failure. Chapter 5, Aftermath and Reflection. The brutal murder of Jin Jae-hyun sent shockwaves not only through Jeju Island but across South Korea. It was a tragic reminder of the devastating consequences that unchecked domestic violence and systemic failures can bring. As the courtroom doors closed behind Beck Gwang-suk and Kim Si-nam, sentenced to decades behind bars, the larger questions about protection, justice, and healing remained open, lingering like an unhealed wound. Pyo's life was shattered beyond repair. Losing her only son, the young man she had tried so desperately to protect, was a heartbreak that no mother should ever endure. Friends described her as withdrawn, consumed by grief but also tormented by guilt. Why didn't I do more, she often wondered aloud, haunted by the what-ifs and could-have-beens that plague many survivors of domestic violence. The community rallied around Pyo, offering support, but the scars ran deep. Jin was remembered as a quiet, kind-hearted boy with dreams that would never come true. Schoolmates spoke of his gentle nature, how he always tried to help others despite his own struggles. The violence and neglect he endured at home contrasted painfully with the bright future that was cruelly taken away. In the weeks following the tragedy, media coverage sparked nationwide conversations about domestic violence in South Korea, an issue often hidden behind closed doors. Experts, advocates, and lawmakers debated reforms, focusing on how to better protect vulnerable families and respond swiftly to warning signs. One key criticism was the police's delayed response and lack of proactive intervention. Despite multiple reports, surveillance requests, and cries for help, the system failed Jean and Pyo when it mattered most. Calls for improved training, victim-centered approaches, and stronger enforcement echoed through public forums. The court sentencing, though severe, also raised questions. Was incarceration enough? Could it deter similar crimes? Would justice bring any peace to those left behind? For many, the answers were complicated and incomplete. Pyo eventually spoke publicly, urging other victims not to stay silent and highlighting the importance of early intervention. If you feel unsafe, reach out. Do not wait for tragedy to strike, she implored, her voice trembling but resolute. Her courage inspired many survivors to seek help, breaking the culture of stigma surrounding domestic abuse. In the wake of Jin's death, social services and NGOs mobilized efforts to improve support networks. Hotlines were expanded, shelters increased capacity, and community awareness programs targeted rural areas where victims often have fewer resources. The tragedy also sparked academic research, analyzing patterns of violence, risk factors, and effective prevention strategies. Researchers highlighted the need for coordinated efforts between police, healthcare, social workers, and educators. For Pyo, the road to healing remains long and painful. Grief counselors helped her confront trauma, but the void left by Jin's absence is profound. Friends and family encourage her to share her story, not just as a cautionary tale but as a testament to resilience and hope. Looking back, Jin's story is a stark reminder of what can happen when systems fail and violence is allowed to escalate unchecked. But it also serves as a call to action, a plea for society to listen, intervene, and protect the most vulnerable among us. The community of Jeju, forever changed, honors Jin's memory through annual vigils and educational campaigns. His life, though tragically brief, became a catalyst for change, shining a light on dark corners where abuse thrives in silence. As this story closes, it is important to remember the human faces behind headlines and court cases. Jin was more than a victim, he was a son, a student, a friend with dreams and a future stolen away. Pyo's courage, though born from unimaginable pain, is a beacon for others fighting their own battles. May Jin's story inspire vigilance, compassion, and justice, ensuring no other family endures the same heartbreak. The path is difficult, but with awareness and action, change is possible. Closing chapter, Lessons and a Call for Change. As we come to the end of this story, it's impossible not to feel the weight of loss and the deep urgency for change. Jin Jianghayan's tragic death is a painful reminder that domestic violence is not just a private issue, it is a societal crisis that demands collective attention and action. Every year, countless individuals like Jin suffer in silence, caught in cycles of abuse that escalate when support systems fail. His story exposes the cracks in those systems, how bureaucracy, lack of resources, and sometimes indifference can cost lives. It challenges us to ask, how many more must endure similar fates before real change occurs? The responsibility does not lie solely with the police or government agencies. It's a shared duty involving communities, neighbors, schools, healthcare providers, and every one of us. Awareness is the first step, recognizing the signs of abuse, believing victims, and offering support without judgment. Legislation and policy reforms are crucial, but so is fostering a culture where victims feel safe to speak up, and abusers are held accountable early on. Technology, like real-time monitoring and emergency alert systems, must be accessible and effectively deployed, not just sitting unused or rationed. Most importantly, we must never underestimate the power of empathy. Behind every statistic is a human life, a family torn apart, and futures cut short. Jin was more than a headline, he was a boy who deserved love, protection, and a chance to grow. To those listening who might be suffering or know someone in a similar situation, please reach out. Help exists, and you are not alone. To the communities and policymakers, let Jin's story fuel meaningful reforms and vigilance. This tragic case should inspire not despair, but determination, a commitment to break cycles of violence and build a safer, more compassionate society. Thank you for listening to this story with an open heart. May it encourage reflection, action, and hope for a future where no child suffers as Jean did. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more compelling true stories like this.